In this video, Dr. Jordan Peterson explains what you need to do to not receive contempt by other people and how you need to think to be prone to success.
In relationship to something, to what the existentialists called like the existential burden. So, people are always doing things in groups. And the groups are often oriented to produce a certain outcome, like a hunting party. We could say that if we're thinking of it from an evolutionary perspective. Like there's a goal, and it's an important goal. And there are going to be good hunters and hunters that aren't so good. And part of the way, and this is to think of a hierarchy as something other than a dominance hierarchy, because the dominance hierarchy theory is slightly flawed because it implies that the hierarchy is only based on power. Right? But that's not right. Like if you have a hunting party or a building crew or anything like that, a lot of what elevates one man above the other in the dominance hierarchy isn't power, it's competence. So the best hunter has the highest reputation, or the best builder has the highest reputation, or, it depends on what the hierarchy is devoted for, but the person who's best at that rises to the top, all other things being equal. And that's often the case even if people don't like them very much. We've done investigations into corporate structures where someone will be approved by a relatively large majority of the people who work for the company because they're hyper competent, but no one really likes them. And so you can't really think of that as either a popularity contest or something that's based on power. And I think that a decent hierarchy is almost never based on power. It's based on competence. Now, those two things get tangled up. But, well, so then you think one of the things that's going to make people prone to being successful is to feel some responsibility in relationship to their capacity to attain a goal in a group situation. And I think that's partly the origin of both conscientiousness and guilt and shame. Lots of times if you talk to unemployed people, and, we hear a lot about rates of depression and that sort of thing, but we're kind of boneheaded about the way we measure things. Like, if you want to be depressed, the best thing to do is lose your job. And then you really got to ask yourself, are you depressed or are you unemployed? Those aren't the same thing, And you might say, well, for some people, unemployment doesn't make them depressed. It's like, well, we know that. That's the unconscientious people. Or maybe the unconscientious people and the emotionally stable people, something like that. But for the people who are conscientious and also maybe somewhat neurotic, man, that's just going to wipe them out. But to think about that as psychological is rather foolish. It's an actual loss, and they're responding to it in an actual way. And so, and usually people who are unemployed, part of the reason that they get depressed is because they're worried about their future, but that's not the only reason. What they often talk about is that they've let people down, So that would be people in their family, or they let themselves down, or they're performing underneath their capacity, or they're just useless and aren't contributing. And those are all places where, their guilt will start to eat them up. And those are the sorts of things that seem also to be associated with conscientiousness. It's like the idea that, you're part of a team of sled dogs, and you have a responsibility to pull your weight. And if you're not pulling your weight, then there's something contemptible about you. And if you happen to be one of those people who aren't pulling their weight, then there's something contemptible about you, even if it's you making the judgment. So, and conscientious people are definitely more judgmental. So, for example, if you if you tell them stories about people who perform various criminal and quasi-criminal acts, and you get them to estimate the sentence that they should be subjected to, the conscientious people will reliably, put people in prison for longer periods of time. They don't like violations of norms or violations of rules. So one of the reasons that there might be a distribution in conscientiousness is like, maybe when the whole economy collapses, which happens fairly frequently, the conscientious people just wipe themselves out. They're so depressed and so self-judgmental and so crushed that they can't handle the what would you call that? That's it's variability. That's not the word I was looking for. So they get clipped off when things fail. Unconscientious person doesn't really care, and that's actually sort of almost like the defining characteristic of an unconscientious person is they don't really care. And that's an interesting thing too, because it's often more fun to be around unconscientious people than it is to be around conscientious people, because it's very hard to relax around people who are really orderly and judgmental. You know, you can't even sit improperly or you get judged for it. Whereas if you're in someone's house and they're unconscientious, you know, and you throw your beer can on the floor, they'll just laugh and throw their beer can on the floor. You know, and so I think it's difficult to relax with really hyper-conscientious people. It's probably difficult to have fun with them. I think it's difficult for them to relax. You know, they tend, like conservative people tend to read less. You know, and you might think, well, that might be associated with their interest in intellectual activity, because they're also lower in openness. But I think it's also because they regard reading as a waste of time. Not because they exactly regard reading as a waste of time, but they feel guilty if they're not working and instead they're sitting down reading a book. So what are you doing sitting down reading a book? You know, there's work to be done. And so they're very work-oriented. So, okay. Orderliness is a good predictor of conservatism, as we've already said, and it's associated with disgust sensitivity and preference for order and tradition, not egalitarianism. So then you think, well, where's the egalitarian motivations? And they all seem to pile up pretty much on agreeableness. So the conscientious people basically say, you can get ahead if you play the game properly and you abide by the rules and you work. And the agreeable people say, well, yeah, but there's lots of people who can't really manage that, and, you know, we're not just going to push them off a cliff. They need to be taken care of, and, you know, the situation wasn't fair to begin with, you know, and there's a battle between that all the time, and there's a battle because agreeableness and conscientiousness are orthogonal, which means that they actually traverse different ethics, right? And they're not opposites on the continuum, conscientiousness and agreeableness. That's not it at all. So, and it looks like in order for people to adjust to the world of human beings, you have to be agreeable to some measure and you have to be conscientious to some measure. And the question is, how much of each? And the answer is, well, it depends on the circumstances and where you place yourself. But the same question applies to the polity at large. How agreeable should it be versus how conscientious should it be? And that's a it's not a problem with the solution. The solution is only to be derived from a continual dialogue, say, between the conscientious people and the agreeable people. Because the answer varies as the environment varies. So you can't come up with an end solution to that problem.